Welcome back to the London Futurists podcast. Calum and I recently attended the BGI 24 event in Panama City. That is the Beneficial General Intelligence Summit and Unconference. One of the speakers we particularly enjoyed listening to was Daniel Faggella, the founder and head of research of Emerj. Something that featured in his talk was a 3x3 matrix with 9 squares, which he calls the Intelligence Trajectory Political Matrix, or ITPM for short. As we'll be discussing in this episode, one of the dimensions of this matrix is the kind of end-goal future that people desire as intelligent systems become ever more powerful. And the other dimension is the kind of methods people want to use to bring about that desired future. So if anyone thinks there are only 2 options in play regarding the future of AI, for example, accelerationists versus doomers, to use 2 names that are often thrown around these days, they're actually missing a much wider set of options. And frankly, given the challenges posed by the fast development of AI systems that seem to be increasingly beyond our understanding and beyond our control, the more options we can consider, the better. Daniel, welcome to the London Futurists podcast.
David, I'm grateful to be here with yourself and Calum, and it was fun to see you two in person.
Thanks for joining us, Daniel.
Daniel, before we dive into the fascinating ITPM matrix of options, what would you like our listeners to know about you?
My day-to-day work, David, is really as a market researcher focused on the practical applications of AI. So for the last 8 years or so, I'm pretty consistently interviewing C-level AI adopters, whether it's the CIO of a Goldman Sachs or the head of AI at a Raytheon, or the folks who are leading some of the most exciting unicorn companies selling into the Fortune 500. Most of my day-to-day work is really getting a pulse of where is this technology creeping its way into call centers, fraud operations, logistics, and other parts of the business and enterprise world. But after doing that for quite some time and keeping a finger on the pulse of the bigger picture, I've very much stayed invested and involved in the bigger game of sort of what humanity is blooming into. And I use kind of my vantage point in the practical world as a pair of goggles to look forward into the future, because I get to see a lot of these trends develop up close and personal with the people spending the big bucks to bring them to life. That's my backdrop. I'm certainly not a professional futurist. I'm certainly not a computer scientist. But I'm a market researcher that gets to talk to the people spending the cash and deploying this stuff in the real world.
But there's one other thing, Daniel, that we ought to cover, which is that you are, I believe, an international wrestling champion. Is that right?
Yeah, national Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu champion. My first business when I was an undergrad, my friends were delivering pizzas or selling insurance or something, and I didn't want to do that. So I opened a martial arts gym because I really like training Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And so, yeah, my first business was that gym, and I trained pretty hard, and my ears will show it, even if I tried to hide my martial arts background. My cauliflower ears will give it away.
Just very briefly, what is Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu?
Fast version of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is if people watch mixed martial arts on the television, so they watch an event like a UFC or a Bellator championships, people are kind of fighting and striking on the feet. Things like boxing and Muay Thai are the martial arts that hail in that domain of fighting. When you get down to the ground and it comes time to take somebody down, it comes time to put somebody in a joint lock or a choke and tap them out or submit them, that's basically Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So you could think about it like wrestling, but very much in a martial arts context. You're not trying to pin somebody, you're trying to incapacitate somebody.
So I see a kind of metaphor here, because you need to bring multiple disciplines to succeed in that mixed martial arts, it seems to me.
That's right.
And as we collectively wrestle with the possibilities of superintelligent AI, I think we're going to need multiple disciplines as well. Just rushing in as computer scientists, or rushing in as economists, or rushing in as would-be ethicists probably isn't going to cut it.
I like it. I mean, I've never drawn the analogy myself. Those lives of mine are somewhat disconnected, but I would not disagree with the statement, David. I think you're on point there.
So let's get back to what you called the bigger game.
Yes.
Which is this matrix of possible approaches. One of the dimensions is the kind of end goal future that people wish for humanity as AI improves. So what have you heard from people as to what they would like to see happen in due course?
What's really surprised me, David, in starting these conversations, it was 9 months ago or so when this idea first dawned on me. Like yourself, David, I very much rail against this notion that we have a polar system of you can be in this camp or this camp, and you have to hate the other camp. I think that the lack of nuance and discourse does no good in terms of bringing us to an aggregately better future. So unpacking and unrolling this and eventually landing on this sort of matrix, I was expecting that more of the people I spoke with would very ardently be in the preservation camp. In other words, they would be in the, let's call it, hominid kingdom for eternity camp. Let us never build anything beyond ourselves. Let us have everything always as a tool. I was expecting much, much more of this, particularly from the people who were relatively convinced that AGI would, let's say, require or almost certainly lead to the end of humans. I'm mostly in that camp myself. I expected most of that camp would be in the Eternal Hominid Kingdom program. But I actually found that most people, even in that camp, are very much in the progression stage, not purely the preservation stage. But their supposition is that we should get some kind of a handle on what it is that we're building and how it's coming about, and making sure it's not an arms race to make sure that we lead somewhere good. Yoshua Bengio, who's one of the first guests who I interviewed specifically about this matrix, Turing Award winner, one of the godfathers of machine learning as an academic discipline, arguably the heaviest voice in machine learning today, he had framed it very, very well. He said, I think that people who are rushing towards blasting this technology off with limited understanding need to have potentially a bit more empathy for the entities that are alive today. And then he also said, and this shocked me because I didn't think he'd be in this camp, the people that are in pure preservation, hominid kingdom forever, should probably have more empathy for the entities yet to come. And I think that his sentiment is actually somewhat natural and normal for people. I think people don't want to be in the generation that has to hand off the baton and perish, I think understandably. But I think a lot of people do see us as part of this natural cycle and process. So I guess, David, one of the big findings for me in speaking to dozens of people, including luminaries as lofty as Bengio, was that actually a lot of the preservation camp is actually pretty able to be seeing themselves as part of a greater natural process, but just making sure that process is not reckless.
I wonder whether that is particularly true of people who've been thinking about AI for quite some time, many of whom will probably have read quite a bit of science fiction.
Absolutely.
I suspect that if you could get what in the UK is called
the man on the street,
the man on the Clapham omnibus, the sort of ordinary person who hasn't thought seriously at all about AI yet, they would probably be in the preserve humanity rather than let's progress beyond humanity camp. But who knows?
I fully believe you're right. And Calum, my suspicion was that a very large chunk of the people thinking about this stuff would also be there, but less of them were than I thought. As for like my parents and my neighbors in the 4,000 person town in Rhode Island that I grew up in, they're not even able to entertain this as an intellectual conversation, never mind as a set of possibilities. So I haven't had as much rich, robust discourse with that portion of the world thus far, but I do believe that the political singularity is coming. It will only be a matter of time in terms of big waves of progression until sort of the everyman becomes very well aware that whether we build God or not and who controls it are the only relevant political questions in the world. I think we've got a countdown timer until it hits the everyman. But right now, it's the people that have been thinking about it, to your point. So that is correct.
You dropped in a term there, the political singularity, which is different from some of the other singularities that Calum and I sometimes discuss. What do you have in mind for that?
People can Google the term, and it's actually funny because it's a 7-year-old essay. The basic hypothesis, I'm going to paraphrase it, but more or less this is word for word, is that there'll be a certain threshold of capability in terms of display and impact in the real world, whereby most people in most places will wake up to the fact that the only super relevant political matters are, again, whether we build the deity and who controls it and how. My suspicion is that there is a tipping point after which you're not as concerned about the local person who's going to redo the sewage system in your 5,000 person town. You're much more concerned about, are they going to let the thing loose and like what's going to happen and who's going to have their hands around it? Is it China? Is it the US? This lab, that lab?
I used to think that would happen when people saw self-driving cars.
Yeah.
which of course aren't commonplace most of the world yet, although the concept has been proved in several states in America.
Yeah.
GPT-4 went some way towards getting there.
Oh, it's been the biggest step.
But by no means the whole way. We need another big wake-up call.
We need another one. And unfortunately, gentlemen, people use Pearl Harbor too much as an analogy. I think it's a little brutal. People say, oh, we're going to need a shocking event like that. I think that's correct. However, the important distinction around a Pearl Harbor is that it was an act of war. It was not going to bring about a pause and assessment of the technology, which is, I think, what some people are looking for when it comes to AI.
Maybe Sputnik moment would be a better analogy.
Sure, Sputnik, or we could think about Independence Day. An alien intelligence lands on the planet.
But by then it's too late.
I think that's the suspicion. But I think we need some kind of a firm impact moment of some sort to get people to be jarred. And to your point, Calum, we would think maybe it'd be self-driving cars. We'd think it'd be this. We'd think it'd be that. I think ChatGPT has been the biggest step function in widening this conversation. I've been tweeting the same things for 10 years, but it's like only now that anybody reads it. And I think ChatGPT has been the main poobah in making that stuff relevant. But I think we need a couple more of those. Every 3 months, I have a good friend who will call me and then really start getting real about this stuff in a way that is deep and somewhat worried. I think it's going to be a couple more step functions up until my parents do. But by the time that happens, I think, again, political singularity scenario will more or less be here, and people will understand what the big game, in fact, is.
So let's continue to flesh out this dimension. At one end of this spectrum, there are people who would like to see humans preserved more or less in the same state.
Yep.
At the other end of this, there are people who want to pass on the baton, who will be quite happy, it seems, whatever kind of superintelligence emerge. They'll say, yes, this is the evolutionary program, and we humans are grateful to be able to be superseded. And there were quite a few people I met at the BGI conference in Panama that seemed to imply that.
Yeah.
Are you a successionist?
Yeah, I am under the right circumstances. And actually, I share this belief with Bengio that there are likely to be intelligences, very morally worthy intelligences beyond us. But it is ridiculous to assume that anything that looks like deep learning that we throw on steroids and we give it a moon-sized compute will automatically be a morally worthy successor to hominids. So I'm very much not of the camp that we ought to recklessly blast in every direction as hard as we can, even if it's a military arms race, and whatever bubbles out of that will inherently be a worthy successor. That doesn't happen to be my belief at all. There are people that are of the belief in a bit of a misanthropic sense that, yes, let's go pedal to the metal. Whatever redded tooth and claw machine bubbles out of that, that's what's supposed to survive. Let's go. Humans don't really matter anyway. I haven't found that many brutally misanthropic takes of that kind. I see more takes about people who are saying, hey, no matter how fast we accelerate, it's only going to make everybody's lives better. There's going to be more jobs. There's going to be curing of diseases. There's going to be better lives and better education for everybody. Everything's going to be better if just things go faster. So there's that camp, which is, let's call it completely consciously ignorant, dogmatically consciously ignorant of the potential risks of creating post-human intelligence. I'm not in that camp. I'm very much in the camp that I think post-human intelligence will probably necessitate our attenuation. But I think that we should think quite ardently about what are the criteria of a worthy successor. I have some in mind. I'm sure other people have theirs. But what would be the criteria of a worthy successor where if we did attenuate, and by the way, hopefully it would be beautiful, splendid, peaceful, blissful attenuation. Maybe we'd get uploaded into a sugar cube and have a simulated trillion years of extended bliss before that compute got used for something actually useful. Maybe we would get granted such a charity. But whatever we hand the baton to, I think would have to have a specific set of traits before and I think people like Bengio, who I don't think is quite as in the ascension camp as I am, would say we should hand the baton to.
Well, you've got to spell out what some of these criteria might be. What would make it morally worthwhile?
Yeah, let's do it. I'm just literally going to pull it up from the article, but people Google worthy successor Faggella or danfaggella.com/worthy, and you can get a sense of sort of how I think through this. I like to think it's absolutely not misanthropic at all, although some people consider these things to be so uncouth that only evil people could think them. I don't consider myself evil, gentlemen, but I'll share my ideas with you. A smattering of ideas. I'm not stating that this list is complete, but here's the way I basically pose it. And I'd love your guys' thoughts, frankly, because we didn't get to speak about this in person. We might imagine a worthy successor list as like a set of capabilities or traits of an AGI, where if it could convince you of those traits, you might not feel terrible, or maybe you'd even feel good about handing it the keys, so to speak. The keys meaning the steering wheel of the trajectory of future intelligence and goals, etc. Right now, those keys are, for the most part, in the hands of hominids. At least we like to tell ourselves that much. Who knows if we have free will? I'm not making those arguments. But I'm saying hominids are the species that, by all appearances, assuming free will is real, is exerting its volition most ardently within the light cone that we can observe. And so there would be a set of traits where maybe it wouldn't feel terrible to hand those keys off to the system. I'm not saying that this set of traits I'm going to list for you, I'm only going to give you 4. I'm not saying that these are permanent and everybody must agree with them. I'm saying these are ideas to put on the table and discuss, because I do think AGI is probably inevitable. And if it is to eventually succeed us, as we have succeeded countless species before us, then probably we should consider what we'd want it to have if it is to be that worthy successor. Again, there's a full article about this at danfaggella.com/worthy, but I'll just give you 4 quick things, bullet points, if I can, David. Can I blitz through these real quick?
Please do.
Excellent. Let's go for it.
You've been teasing us for the last 5 minutes, so now's the time for the reveal.
Well, if I blitz right into them, you'd take them as, well, you think that's more valuable than people. So I do the tee up because I say, gentlemen, I think it's worth talking about. That's all I'm telling you. So here's the 4 things I think are worth talking about. And these are not in any order. Number 1, if an AI could convincingly tell you what it would do to explore the galaxy or nature itself in a compelling and insightful way via human-like avatar, but whenever it speaks to you, you get the very clear, crisp sort of understanding that its brain is to yours as you are to a cricket, and its plans intuitively make sense, and it can demonstrate and showcase these things, and maybe even have physical demonstrations of how its rocketry would work, etc. That would be maybe one trait. Another one might be if it could literally, people talk about technology at a sufficient level is like magic. If it could materialize spaceships or food or other materials or things out of thin air with nanotechnology or other advancements that we don't understand, if it could launch itself into a fleet of vessels traveling near light speed and convert other planets into vessel-making material and stars into energy-providing hubs beyond anything that we could conceive of, vastly beyond the Kardashev scale, which is a hominid idea. We should talk about post-hominid ideas, massively more brilliant, sparkling things throughout the galaxy, and maybe we can even observe it. And maybe even if it could convincingly tell you of its near infinite range of blissful sentient experiences, and if it can use non-invasive brain-computer interface, or maybe invasive, to be able to help show you some of the sentient sphere that it has access to, cracking open your mind as if you could take a cat and have it be Shakespeare writing a sonnet, or take a worm and have it be, I don't know, some explorer finding a new island somewhere or something along those lines. Completely mind-opening in terms of both bliss and expansive cognitive abilities. And it could actually showcase that and say, this is a smattering of some of the things, dear human, that I can see and that I can experience in a near infinite way beyond you. If those 4 things occur, I'm not saying they're likely to. I'm not even saying that. I'm just saying if all 4 of them occurred, personally, I wouldn't have a violent, wild opposition to saying, you know what, pal? I think you should probably take the keys. By then, it already has the keys, by the way, but I wouldn't be horribly opposed to it if it had those traits.
Daniel, presumably this worthy successor is one of the points in your 9-box matrix of this intelligence trajectory political matrix. Is it one of the 9 possible outcomes?
I don't know if it is. I think the worthy successor is an idea that only exists probably in the ascension column. However, any of those 3 ascension columns could consider what they are building to be a worthy successor.
Okay.
I happen to be a B3 person. I want to try to avoid authoritarianism for various and sundry reasons. I want to probably really try to avoid total open source, laissez-faire state of nature. And I happen to think that's most likely to birth the worthy successor. There might be others who say the worthy successor could only be rightly birthed if there was a global government, or if there was a wide sweeping state of nature, just like we have elsewhere, then only that would be able to bubble up a worthy successor.
Maybe we should go back to basics, because I haven't got a grasp on what this matrix looks like. Is there an x-axis, which is ascension, and a y-axis, which is something else? What does it look like?
I'll pop it in the chat. You can also just Google intelligence trajectory political matrix. If there's another one out there, by the way, God bless their hearts, but you're probably only going to find one article. So along the top, from left to right, along the top, you've got preservation, which is hominids as they are, progression, which is augmenting human brains and building strong AI that serve humanity. And then number 3, you have ascension, which is blasting beyond humans as we have blasted beyond fish with legs. And then on the left-hand side, let's call this the y-axis. At the bottom of that y-axis, we've got openness, which is total laissez-faire, internationally and nationally around AI and AI-related technologies, neurotech, etc. The middle would be collaborative, something like what we have today, some degree of an international order. And the top would be controlled, which would be very firmly locked down, national and international controls over hardware, over neurotech, etc., etc., etc. So you can find yourself from A1 all the way to C3.
So the matrix is not outcomes, it's policies which humans might pursue.
I wouldn't even call it policies. I would say it's a way of identifying preferable or non-preferable futures for an individual person. Now, what I would argue, Calum, and people could disagree with me, and that's fine. What I would argue is that if I know where you sit on the intelligence trajectory political matrix, I may be able to guess some of the things that you would advocate for in terms of policy. Right now, people just bark back and forth. We should have more regulation of this, less regulation of that, rah, rah, rah. And it's just sort of back and forth about individual issues. I think this is actually a way to zoom out from policy decision A, policy decision B, policy decision C. And I think this is a way to say, wait a second, where are you ultimately trying to go? What's a worthy future for you as an individual? And what backs that up? And so I don't think this is policies per se. I think this is desired preferable or non-preferable destinations for individual people, and that those would be indicative of the kinds of policies you would want. If you sit in C2, you want progression but not ascension, but you also want openness, probably there's certain kinds of policies I could anticipate might be more interesting to you. Less authoritarian, less ascension-oriented, less purely preservationist, etc. So hopefully that's clear, Calum. I see these less as policies and more as preferable and non-preferable futures that open up policy discourse.
So you described yourself as a B3.
Mm-hmm.
The B refers to collaborative.
That's right.
Rather than being over-controlled or being overly open.
Yeah.
That puts you in the B, in the middle in that dimension. Whereas the 3 pushes you more to the end on the other dimension, 1 being preservation, 2 being progression, and 3 being ascension.
Yeah.
I think I'm more in the B 2.5 or somewhere between the two. Because I'm not yet sure that I'm ready to hand over to a superintelligence. I want to ensure that we create a superintelligence that really is a worthy successor before we get too far down that route.
I'm in complete agreement with you. So just for clarity here, I think there's probably much more that I can do in terms of how people are pinned to this matrix. And there is no permanent pinning, of course. Anybody can change their opinion, mine included, at any time, and people can mess with this matrix however they'd like. But to your point, David, I personally very much concur. I'm not of the belief that what we have now is a worthy successor and we should blast off. I am of the belief that ascension will be almost certainly a net good. I've got all sorts of my own moral and philosophical arguments for that. But I'm not of the belief that we should blast there as recklessly and ridiculously as possible because it's just guaranteed to be a good time. You might say that even for right now, I'm kind of more in the B2.5 camp, but I'm very much fully acknowledging the inevitability and, in my personal opinion, the net good, if we can get there, of achieving what would genuinely be a worthy successor. To your point, and I agree vehemently, not everything we could blast off with would be guaranteed to be such a thing.
So would the difference between progression and ascension be that if you think that the future could be being post-human, that would put you in the ascension camp, whereas if you think we should remain human, that would put you in the progression camp?
I think roughly human or human-ish. If you talk to somebody like Rocco, famous Rocco's basilisk thought experiment creator, who's relatively active on Twitter. One of my early discourses was with him and Roman Yampolsky. He's sort of the belief that, yes, we should augment our minds. Maybe we should build AI that serves us. But even if we do turn into something sort of post-human eventually, it should have, and I haven't quite dug deep enough into his philosophy here, so I'm probably wording it inadequately, but it needs to maintain some kind of core element of humanness or human values or something along those lines. So maybe that starts to sniff a little bit like Ascension after a long enough period of time, but he's really insistent that it really is hominid-like all the way down to its core. Whatever we're building upon is building on whatever his philosophical attachments are to Homo sapiens.
And within the Ascension column, would that include both people who think that we should become post-humans and our minds uploaded and we could become pretty much unrecognizable to today's humans? It would include that idea, but also the idea that we hand over to a successor species and humans cease to exist, indeed our mind cease to exist, and there is this worthy successor, which I don't particularly like. Both of those camps are in the Ascension column?
Yeah. And you even have some folks that are overtly misanthropic. They're on Twitter and they write things. Those folks are out there. So you've got overt misanthropy. You've got folks that say, I want to live forever, and it sure would be cool to have 7 robot bodies doing different stuff on different planets, or whatever their perception is.
That all falls into Ascension.
Yeah, all of that would. And then there's some people in the worthy successor camp who aren't like, hey, let's hand up the baton because dying is cool. There's some people in the worthy successor camp that are like, hey, let's hand up the baton because all things eventually attenuate, and it would be super cool if we got to live this out as long as we could, but let's not play no games like we're going to be the ones steering the ship a million years from now. So some people in the worthy successor camp are sort of there. They're not in the, I don't value myself and I don't love anyone, hand it off. No. I would definitely refuse that label pretty ardently. So there's that whole spectrum in the Ascension camp.
So there's at least 9 different approaches that people might take to steering AI in the sense of where do they want it to take us eventually and how should we get there. How are we going to reach a conclusion as a society as to whether one of these 9 is preferable? Or is it likely we're going to have 9 different camps, or maybe more than 9 different camps, each pursuing their own agendas?
I am not a grand optimist about human niceties and peace per se, but I think in the last 100 years, we've done some pretty interesting things. Writ large, it's kind of amazing that we've done this whole civilization technology stuff, given where we started species-wise. So who knows what we're capable of? I don't know precisely what it looks like for us to move forward. I have a suspicion, and this is merely a suspicion, gentlemen, that it may behoove us, species-wise, to get some idea of preferable and non-preferable futures in some degree of international order and alignment. I don't know if that's possible. It may do more bad than good. I'm not sure. But I think that some alignment around preferable and non-preferable futures would at least give us legs to step forward. The analogy I used at Goertzel's conference was, imagine we're in a car. I want to go to San Francisco, and let's just say that that's B1. And then you'd like to go to Miami, and let's say that that's C3. We could both jump in the car and at each intersection fight over the steering wheel violently. I'll rip it to the left, you rip it to the right. We see whoever wins, and then we go to the next intersection, we fight again. That would be dealing with things issue by issue by issue. Okay, hardware, how do we govern it? Fight over it. Or we could have the really hard conversation up front about big picture. Where are you trying to take us? What do you think would be good? 50 years from now, what would be a net good situation? What do you think? And I think laying those ideas on the table and getting some coherence around what we can agree on. And David, I'm not telling you I think it's possible, but I think getting some coherence on that would be a pretty good idea ahead of a road trip, and an even better idea ahead of the road trip of the trajectory of intelligence itself, which is a little bit more consequential.
I think it's certainly a good idea to get a conversation going about what we want out of this. It may well be, of course, that we can have more than one outcome. There's a book by Greg Egan, an Australian science fiction author, called Diaspora, in which humanity has forked into 3 different tribes or almost species. There's one which has uploaded their minds into computers. They live entirely virtual lives. They don't die. They have incredibly vibrant and joyous lives, all sorts of possibility. There's a middle path trod by people who have transferred their minds into very large robots, which are indestructible, very powerful. These things are called Gleisner robots, and they tramp around the world. And then there's a third group called the Atomists, who didn't want any of this. They wanted to stay as normal and more or less unaugmented humans. They improve their health somewhat, but they're mortal and they look like humans that we would recognize today. And these three types of humans exist on different planets around the galaxy, all at the same time. They don't necessarily like each other very much, but they tolerate each other.
Yeah.
That's another possible outcome. Not everybody has to end up in the same place.
I think that's right. And I think that that would be one thing to put on the table. I think what I advocate for when I go to the intergovernmental world, so I'm speaking at the United Nations in 3 days, it's about physical security in this aviation space. But I'm going to sprinkle in some of that AGI stuff. You can't get me behind a mic and just have me talk about the day-to-day. But when I'm in the OECD as an AI Futures group with Benjio and others, I'm very much advocating for, let's just put on the table, where do we think we should go? And hash those things out that way, as opposed to making them a wrestling match whenever we talk about hardware or databases or this kind of data or this kind of issue. Let's try to get aligned on the big picture. And to your point, Calum, there may be clusters and groups that can have their cake and eat it too. And I think that would be sparklingly fantastic and much better than a constant wrestling match between a false dichotomy of political bipartisanism.
The risk with that future is that one of the groups may not play nice with all the others.
Oh, certainly.
And this is the fear that if there is a superintelligence, then it will decide to preemptively get rid of anything that in due course might threaten it. Earlier you said that you thought actually that superintelligence is likely to end up being a worthy successor for various arguments that you had. I think I remember you saying that. And I think before we get people to agree on a future, we're going to have to win that argument.
Sure.
Otherwise, people are going to say, well, there's too much of a risk that it's going to be bad, therefore I don't want to go anywhere near that. We shouldn't let anybody go there.
Yeah.
So can you justify that maybe there's a good reason to think it will be roses?
I'll be clear. I don't. So what I said was, I'm very much in the camp that probably AGI implies our attenuation. I don't believe that AGI inherently necessitates a worthy successor. Rosy wouldn't be my stance, but doom is also not my stance. In some regards, David, I liken myself to some of the middle of the road perspectives that you hold through our conversations over the years. So I'm very much not in that camp. If you'd like, I could talk about why I think it necessitates our attenuation, which Calum seemed to disagree with. But just to be very clear for everybody, I don't believe it will always be a worthy successor. I think we'd have to very carefully calibrate what we're building and how it's fuming before we can know that it has traits that could make it such.
What do you mean by attenuation?
Attenuation like fading away.
Okay. So humans die out.
Maybe it's not violent and immediate. So attenuation doesn't mean like everybody gets lined up with a firing squad, right? That's not attenuation. It could be.
But within 1,000 years or so, there are no minds which were alive in humans before.
There you go. Yep. Sort of bowing out by our own will or otherwise. I am of the belief that AGI probably requires that or would imply that. And I'm not saying I necessarily like that. I just say, unless I really wear a child's goggles, I can't look forward at the future and expect hominids to be coddled that well.
Why don't you think that we could merge with the superintelligence, which is Kurzweil's idea?
Kurzweil, there's some rosy glasses for you. I respect Kurzweil tremendously, by the way. I mean, one of the earliest authors that I read. People every day should wake up and be like, how is that guy right about so many things? But even Kurzweil is very clear. The biological, non-biological will emerge. I think two things. A, probably that's a relatively necessary ingredient to really achieve general intelligence. And secondly, it might be a nice little way to stave off our immediate irrelevance. So I think it might be a double whammy there. So I'm very much an advocate for that direction and dimension. I've been interviewing people at BrainGate. So I'm from Rhode Island. Brown is associated with BrainGate. Real hardcore brain-computer interface stuff. 11 years were my first interviews in that camp. And I've been deep in the game. I'm an advocate. I have hopes. I'm a little disappointed in the last 10 years of progress, but hopefully we'll have some better stuff. Kurzweil mentioned the eventual fading away of, let's call it the biological part of that shebang.
But he would argue that the most important part of us could survive, and that's our minds. He would think our bodies are fairly irrelevant.
Yeah, the ship of Theseus theory, you replace different parts and all of a sudden now it's the same consciousness just in a non-biological vessel.
Whether it happens gradually or all at one go, the idea is you preserve human minds and perhaps they combine and live in a hive mind, or perhaps there's a constellation of all the existing human minds.
Yeah.
They survive into the future. They don't attenuate, in his view.
I would consider that a piping plover scenario. Where I live, there is a bird called the piping plover. And the piping plover, if left to its own devices, would die. But we, generous and giving as we are, us hominids, such gracious and eternally benevolent hominids, we've carved out certain segments of beach where people can't go and can't do stuff so that these birds, who nature has essentially mandated to death, will not die and can do whatever they do. I have nothing against piping plovers, but I'm not inherently more in favor of them than I am rock doves or hedgehogs. But for some reason, the tax dollars do like them more than rock doves or hedgehogs. And so I think that we could count on some degree of kindness to be able to maintain my own memories, my own continuation of, you could call it my instantiation of consciousness. But I would suspect that a machine that has drunken in all of my best ideas and all of yours and all of yours and all of everybody listening, and is running on planet-sized compute, astronomically faster compute, et cetera, that my contributions in terms of being part of the stream of life would no longer be relevant. So if I was granted compute to live in, or maybe physical space to live in, it would be because something that has better use for that compute than I do. Just like, Calum, you have better use for the land that you built your house on, or let's say a hospital on, than the roly-poly bugs that used to live on that dirt. So it would be because something has seen me as a roly-poly that it wished to keep in a jar for a while. I don't think it's likely to sustain long-term. Now, I would hope for it. I think it's a sparkling and brilliant wish.
If I can just interrupt.
Please.
But I think that's a rather bleak interpretation of Kurzweil's vision. I think he has a more optimistic view than that one.
Oh, he does. We have very different views here, but yeah, go on.
Which is that the human minds that get uploaded, they continue to grow and they expand enormously. So to the extent that there is any such thing as personal identity, that's debatable.
Yeah.
But to the extent there is, it continues. And so you and I continue to feel that we're existing, but our minds expand enormously and become part of this much bigger mind world. So we don't actually die, we don't attenuate, but we expand and we continue. So we're not pets. We're not sort of little roly-polies or pets. We're part of the great adventure.
Would we not perish and turn into new forms like all of other nature? Do we cross this barrier where now we're this immortal spirit that only grows and goes up? Or are we sometimes killed or crushed by opponents? Does the state of nature end, basically?
I think it would be preferable if we weren't crushed. I think it would be preferable if we did join the great adventure.
I think it'd be preferable if the state of nature wasn't the case right off the jump, my brother. If most things living right now didn't die while being eaten alive, kicking and screaming, I think that'd be preferable right now.
Yeah.
And maybe we can create a future that's better than that, for sure. I hope. But I think there will be different interests involved, and maybe there could be some piece where we can also contribute. I'm currently pessimistic, but definitely open to it. And I do recognize Kurzweil is an optimist, and he's a smarter man than I.
I've got one practical question. This is an incredibly interesting conversation in my view. It's the kind of conversation that needs to take place again and again. But all three of us occasionally get asked by business people to come and talk to them about the future of AI. And I know from experience that when I do take the conversation in this direction, they say, well, individually it's interesting, but it's not going to really help our company. So please don't come back. Or please don't talk about this. Do you have any tips on how to manage these conversations yourself?
I don't get that response, David.
Oh, I want to hear Calum's tips. If Calum's been able to speak about this stuff with the business crowd, I would love his ideas on this one.
I find people are quite up for a bit of long-term speculation. They don't want too much of it, but they find it quite interesting. I rarely find I convert many people. They're more interested, I think, in the future of jobs than in the future of humanity post-singularity.
Yeah.
Because they're absolutely obsessed, most of them, with what their child, nephew, niece should study at university and what career they should go into.
Yes.
But no, I don't find it turns people off.
Dan, your experience?
I find that it very much does. I think that there's really two core responses for me. I wish I was Calum. You know what I think it is? It's his accent. I don't have what he's got going on. I'm just an American. There's no cachet.
Yeah, but you have all this enthusiasm, Daniel.
Maybe. I don't know what that makes up for in sophistication. Brute forcing can only get you so far. I get either a sort of a passing through, like as if the idea goes through them like gamma rays or something like that, where it just isn't even fully accepted. They could listen to a whole talk and just, like there's a meme about this where there's a guy at a grill, like barbecuing, and he says, yeah, that's crazy, man. Anyway, did you see the game last night? That meme, I think, is often the response that I'll receive, even in the policy circles. Like I'm at the OECD and these other places, and these people are talking. AGI is at least on the table as a topic of discourse, but thinking about its implications, even for people who do this for a living, pass right through. I think A, it might be because it's too divergent from their current reality. B, it might require staring into the void in a way that's wildly disturbing for most people. I think there might be a limitation in metacognition sometimes, but I think more often it's just like, this is too different or it's too disturbing to actually sit and chew on. Like, I'm going to let this pass through. I get more of that.
Maybe one of the reasons why I don't find it turns people off. I mean, I agree with you. Most people don't really want to think terribly serious about AI. They do want to talk about the football. But I am always very careful to leave people with a very positive, upbeat message. I don't shy away at all from the very serious risks that advanced AI raises. But I do leave people with a positive message because I think that's really the only polite and reasonable thing to do. And it also happens to chime with what I think. I am naturally fairly optimistic, and I do think our future is very plausibly glorious. I think maybe that's why people are not too dismissive of it.
I like that a lot. Plausibly glorious. I think that's a good one, David. We got a good quote out of this. It wasn't for me, but we got one.
Plausibly glorious future.
Yes.
I think we should wind up. But Daniel, are there any other thoughts that you think ought to be left with our listeners?
I definitely encourage folks to just Google intelligence trajectory political matrix, download the thing, figure out where you stand, or even just change it. I'm really trying to find a way to open up conversation beyond bipartisanism and think about where do we sit, why do we feel that way, and what can we do about it. I think those are much more civil discussions. Would love to hear what the listeners have to say. And then otherwise, David, Calum, I hope we get to go deeper on the worthy successor criteria if either of you guys have them, but we'll have to save that for another day. I'm just grateful we got to have a fun chat today.
Thanks very much.
Excellent stuff, Daniel. Thank you very much.